Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. We've got a great episode today. All the better because one of this channel's most popular guests is hosting. Many of you know Mike Breen from his starring role in the #1 MeidasTouch documentary, Against All Enemies. Mike is a former Army intel officer who led a human rights organization, and I cannot think of anyone better to interview today's guest, Elle Reeve. Elle is a journalist and author, and her new book, Black Pill: How I Witnessed the Darkest Corners of the Internet Come to Life, Poison Society, and Capture American Politics, is a tour de force of investigative journalism. If you want to understand how the worst aspects of right-wing online culture seep into the mainstream, you don't want to miss this one. Here is Mike Breen and Elle Reeve.
You know, I think something that a lot of us have been wondering for years. When I used to think of the far right, and when I used to think of professional racism, and when I used to think of the violent edge of that movement, I used to think of people like the Hammersmith gang. I used to think of people like the ones who lived in the world we all saw in the movie American History X. I used to think of guys who maybe grew up without a lot of money or answers, but with a certain toughness, a certain facility for violence. And then I looked at Charlottesville, and I looked at your interviews in Charlottesville, an incredible documentary that you did. And I saw a lot of people that looked a lot like pudgy middle-class guys in polo shirts. Who are these guys, and how did they get here?
Yes. I mean, that was the question that the old timers in the white nationalist movement also had at the beginning of the rise of the AltRight, which was this new internet savvy, younger, more middle class part of white nationalism. I interviewed this guy, Jeff Scoop, who ran the National Socialist movement for almost 30 years. He has now renounced white nationalism. But around 2014, 2015, he starts noticing all these guys coming online who he called girly boys. You know, this guy was rough and tumble. He wore reinforced knuckles on his gloves. You know, he's a tough guy. And these fancy girly boys were suddenly part of this broader racism movement, and they were obsessed with a cartoon frog. He thought it was bizarre. The alt-right brought in a much more middle-class movement. There had also been these old fancy racists, these Tweety guys. They'd been around for decades. And they are always trying to encourage new, younger people to come in and be the face of their movement. But they mostly failed until the early 2010s, when suddenly there was all this energy online.
And I guess that takes us to what is this energy online? What does it mean to take the black pill? For those of us who aren't terminally online, what does it mean?
Right. So it's a metaphor that has become central to politics on the internet. It comes from the Matrix, where Neo, Keanu Reeves, is presented a red pill and a blue pill. He takes the blue pill. He goes back to this pleasant reality, America in 1999. It's a fantasy created by machines, but he won't know the difference. Or he takes the red pill and he's flushed into horrible reality where humans are enslaved to the machines. So taking the red pill has become a term for taking on some form of far-right politics. And what's interesting about it, right, is that it's this idea that you're not believing something new, but that you're stripping away your illusions and just seeing the truth. It presents far-right extremism as the truth. So from that became many other pills. Became a very flexible piece of slang, right? Right now we're seeing your coconut pilled for Kamala Harris. But black pill is the one that I think is the most important because it's this state of mind that is really dangerous and is how some people are able to rationalize committing acts of violence. It's a nihilism, an almost gleeful nihilism, that everything is corrupt. The system is going to collapse and you should root for it to collapse and maybe even help that process along because what comes after it will be a golden age. And that way you can justify breaking the laws, the norms, the morals, the ethics that were created by this corrupt, morally bankrupt system. You don't need to obey those rules because it upholds a regime that you think is corrupt.
So that's a really interesting idea, this sort of accelerationist nihilist fantasy that we live in a morally imperfect society that deserves to collapse, The part that really confuses me about it is the idea that what follows will necessarily be better. As a combat veteran who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, I've done refugee work. I've worked in human rights. I've seen a lot of societies that were morally imperfect and did collapse. And what follows is pretty much always a bloody nightmare for everybody. So I guess I wonder, is this belief that washing the current world away will lead us to some better place? Do you see that as you talk to these guys? Is that naivete? Is that the longing for some kind of zombie apocalypse, ultra-violent world they think they're going to do better in? Is it both? I mean, why are they so sure what follows is going to be this golden age you're talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because the reason I think this type of thinking is ideologically neutral, right? It can take hold on the left. So when I was in Portland in 2020, I was with a lot of protesters who had started off just protesting police violence, and had one I spoke to had sort of talked himself into believing that change was impossible without a violent revolution. And I was just like, do you know anyone who's in Iraq? Dude, like, do you know what it looks like when a high-powered rifle blows off someone's head? It's horrible. Like, no, of course the answer is no. He hadn't really thought that far. I do generally see more of an interest in the idea of the final climactic apocalyptic moment when everything comes crashing down, more than a fixation on what comes next. Of course, among the white nationalists that I interviewed, they believe themselves to have very high IQs, and they think they will rise to the top. They think society will be better. Many of them also want, it's almost sad. There's a longing for a wholesome family where everyone's happy. It's usually a very patriarchal family, but they will post these images of an idealized family with, a physically fit, attractive man with a demure, beautiful woman sort of hanging on his shoulder, and two smiling children. Often they're in wheat fields. It's sunset. There's like amber waves of green, the whole thing. There's a longing to have that. They think family values have fallen apart, and they want that for themselves.
That's interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between that longing for social connection and that longing for a traditional male role, or maybe even that longing for a girlfriend, and what leads people to this movement?
Yeah. One of the people I profile is Matt Parrott. He was born in 1982, so really came of age online. He wasn't born with a lot of money, but he was tested. He was IQ tested to have a very high IQ, and that became a very central part of his identity. And now he says that he turned it into a cult of self-worship, but at the time, it was like black and white government issued proof that he was better than everyone else. And he was pretty lonely. And as a teenager in atheist chat rooms, he met a much older woman, 11 years older, and they struck up a relationship. And at the age of 21, he became the the step parent to two 10 and 12-year-old girls. His wife was 11 years older than him. So, and he had a sort of come to Jesus moment, literally, and decided to dedicate his life to faith, family, and folk. That became his slogan throughout his time in white nationalism. And as he becomes more important in this movement, he's writing these articles, he's in all these white nationalist rooms, he goes to conferences, he's building up his reputation as a hateful person. But he believes, and still believes, he's doing this in pursuit of upholding this family. The entire time his family is falling apart because his wife has diabetes and sort of begins doctor shopping for more and more intense levels of healthcare until she becomes addicted to opioids and eventually contemplates assisted suicide, and then finally leaves him for someone else. And this whole time he's writing these essays about the decline of manhood in America and in the West, and the decline and how men need to step forward and take care of their families and do the right thing, be your brother's keeper. But if you look at his actual family, it's not falling apart because of a conspiracy by Jews or liberals or women or Black people. It was the individual, it was the choices of his own wife and himself, his complicity in helping her hurt her own health.
Right. And one of the things that really does stand out in your book and your reporting is just how consistently this path leads people to terrible results, right? To financial ruin, to legal problems, to shattered relationships, to losing their marriages if they have them. And yet people seem to keep following this trail, right? Even really successful people, like Elon Musk and other people like that. And I want to get to that in a minute, but what do you think is the attraction of this world for the people that join it?
So Matt Parrott and Matt Heimbach, two prominent white nationalists I interviewed, they were both diagnosed with Asperger's as kids. You see in these extremism message boards, chat rooms, frequent references to people being on the autism spectrum. Now, I don't have proof of any of the anonymous posters if they truly are, but I did interview Dr. Rachel Lofton, who examined Dylan Roof for his sentencing. She's a psychologist. She diagnosed him with autism while he was in jail. She told me that people on the autism spectrum are often drawn to extremist communities because they can interact without social anxiety with other people. It offers a very rigid and clear worldview for explaining why things are the way they are. And there's an archive where you can go back and look at how people interacted with each other and mimic those social interactions. So there are several people who that's part of it. There are other alienated people for whom it offers a kind of brotherhood. Like they've never had guy friends before. One former Proud Boy named Russell Schultz told me these guys have never had a wingman, and they want to be able to go out to a bar, maybe pick a fight with someone and know that some other guy has their back. There's so much in this movement about women, breeding, who's having babies. But at the end of the day, it so much of their anxiety is about wanting to have high status in front of other men, wanting to have male friends, wanting to have brotherhood, wanting to feel like a real man.
It's interesting. I really want to ask you about the relationship between misogyny, between how they tend to view women and talk about women in these communities, and the communities themselves, and what makes them work and what leads people to them. But I'm also struck by something you said about the ability to go back and in a detailed way look at what's been said and sort of mimic those social interactions. And it strikes me that maybe that helps explain some of the relationship, and I'm just kind of guessing, between, or the cultural echoes between the way this movement talks to itself and its meme culture and its inside jokes and its decoding, its obsession with detail, and the way other online communities that are really deep on much less dangerous things like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever seem to act and talk. And there's a real almost a symmetry there that I think is really weird for a lot of us who are not part of either of these two groups of folks to sort of see when we see it. That desire for belonging and meaning makes sense. How does that touch on how these folks think about, talk about, interact with women, both abstractly and the women in their lives?
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. So I interviewed an incel in 2018. He lived in a studio apartment in Florida, paid for by his mom, never left the house. Now, incels involuntarily celibate. They believe they have been doomed by their DNA to never have sex because they're ugly or their personalities are so unappealing. This guy's like perfectly fine looking and smart and charming enough. But he believed in this, that he was just doomed to being an incel because of his social anxiety. So he spent all day online, sometimes going without sleep for more than a day. Some of these guys do drugs in order to be able to stay awake, like in these chat rooms. Like their computer becomes their whole world. And, I met this guy's name was Joey, and I felt compelled to say, like, have you ever tried like running? That really boosts your endorphins, all kinds of things like that. I was like, but he laughed. He'd heard all those tips before. One of the jokes within the incel world is just be yourself, because they believe that for a Chad, a likable guy, this sort of alpha male, being himself works for him because he's the kind of person that people like. Whereas when they are themselves, most people are repulsed. That's what they believe. And, when I called him after our piece aired, he told me this really haunting story. It's so simple, but he had gone out. He lived in Florida near the beach. He'd gone out to the beach and he'd walked out into the waves and he was staring out into the ocean at sunset. And he remembered thinking that it was beautiful, but that he would think it was more beautiful and he would like it better if it was on his computer screen.
That is strangely heartbreaking. It really is.
Right. And these are real people. I've interviewed so many of them over many, many hours. I get to know their whole lives. It would be much easier if they were just simply monsters, but they're regular people with hopes and dreams, just like the rest of us.
Yeah, it really would be much easier, wouldn't it? But of course they're not. And I wonder how much of the answer to this you think, I wonder what you think the answer to this is, if there is one. Is it inclusion? Is it some way of returning all of us to the same conversation? Is it a willingness for, some of us who do have an easier time in life with, casual conversations and meeting new people and that kind of thing, being a lot more aware of who we don't see in a room? Hard to turn that into a policy solution maybe, but I mean, how much of this, in other words, is about the pain that some of these people feel and their need to share it with the rest of us, and all the racism and the accelerationist desire to destroy our whole society and the violence? I don't want to say all of it, but a lot of it becomes essentially just a package that pain can live in. Or do you think this really is an ideology that people believe in their bones once they believe it, and it's harder than I'm making it sound?
All right, let me take that one step at a time. I'm not an expert. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not an expert in childhood education, that kind of thing. But after doing all of this reporting, I do believe that schools should have like remedial social skills class, the same way you might have remedial math or English for people who are struggling. Like, I really like, for some kids, it's not intuitive how to have a conversation. It's not intuitive how to, Matt Heimbach, he got lessons as a child that a conversation was like a game of tennis and you lob the ball back and forth. Even if you're not that interested. Like, that's intuitive to the average person, but not to a lot of people. And I think that needs to be taught. I also think that a strange side effect of all these far right guys, like extremists on 4chan, talking about autism all the time, is that has filtered into the mainstream and actually given people a lot more awareness about neurodivergence, and it has allowed, it gives more of an excuse of why a kid who might have been called weird before is now sort of given more of an allowance because maybe his or her brain is wired differently. That said, not everyone had it rough. Like Richard Spencer, upper middle class, went to fancy schools, played on the football team. He did have trouble in school when he was young because he was very dyslexic. But he told me essentially a lot of his bitterness came down to, again, social status. He didn't get into Princeton. He often felt rejected by elites. He also described himself as a narcissist, and people throw that term around, but it actually is a psychiatric diagnosis. He has not sought that, but that can interfere with your functioning in your daily life. And clearly it has for Spencer. This was a recurring problem for him. He was unable to maintain sort of a sidekick relationship for longer than 6 months. Eventually, even the white nationalist movement turned on him because of his narcissism.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here because I have 2 favors to ask. We're off to a great start with the Ken Harbaugh Show on YouTube, but the podcast needs a little love. Please click the link below to follow, rate, and review. The success of shows like this really does depend on those ratings. And if you haven't yet followed me on Patreon, please check it out. It's free to sign up, or you can pitch in a few bucks a month. Every dollar goes back into this show and our pro-democracy efforts, including the reporting from Ukraine. Go to patreon.com/Ken Harbaugh. Thanks for the support.
I am struck, and I do want to ask you about some of the larger cultural figures that seem to be trafficking conspiracy theories that sound a lot like what the alt-right movement maybe has believed for a long, long time. Used to be fringe beliefs. I'm thinking of people like Tucker Carlson talking about the great replacement theory, the idea that, the left or elites want to essentially replace white Americans with a different demographic that's easier to politically control or something like that. And it's tied to refugees, tied to immigration. People, of course, like Donald Trump and sort of would-be politicians, like even people like Josh Hawley. I think about him a lot. Here's a Yale Law School graduate, sort of nobody's definition of a tough guy, trying to fist bump the Jan 6 rioters, writing books on what it means to be masculine in America. A lot of these guys are confusing to look at because they kind of strike me as these sort of bow tie tough guys. They have elite backgrounds. They don't come across as particularly, 1980s action movie masculine. Not that matters. But they seem to see a huge amount of political potential in this movement. And at the same time, we often talk about it like it's a strange fringe movement of people who kind of can't succeed in life most of the time, including in the movement, as you said about Richard Spencer and other people who just kind of run into cliffs trying to be leaders in this movement. Is there a broader appeal here? Is there a way in which these media figures like Tucker and these politicians like Donald Trump have tapped into some kind of massive groundswell of these feelings? Or am I missing something about the way the fringe has become the mainstream?
Well, when I interview white nationalists and ask them, how were you red pilled, essentially? How did you become an extremist? How did you become racist? They will say, there's a lot of ambient racism in America. It's not like you have to try that hard, right? If you're looking for stereotypes about Black people, turn on the TV. There's the news, there's movies, there's TV, there's what music is promoted. It's not like they had to work that hard to become racist. So yes, I think a lot of those ideas are ambient and in the culture and pull on people, maybe if they're not fully, Hitler Heiling extremists, right? But they feel the pull of some of those extreme beliefs. I think the masculinity thing is much, much more powerful than the overt racism. It's just many, many more people, many more men find that appealing than this like goofy, almost costumey, swastika wearing stuff. with folks like Tucker Carlson or Josh Hawley, men who grew up pretty fancy and put on this kind of man of the people facade, I think that it's actually doing them a favor by suggesting they're not sincere, that they don't really believe it, that hidden behind all that, they're actually like intellectuals just like the rest of us on the East Coast or something like that, that actually they have a sophisticated understanding of Trump. I think from my research, when people say it publicly, you should just assume that they believe it. They believe it enough. They believe it enough to act on it, to broadcast it, or in the case of the people I talk to, drive across the country to march on it in Charlottesville or storm the Capitol. They believe it enough. Maybe there's some irony or some joking or some winking, but it doesn't matter. Fundamentally, that distinction doesn't matter.
Do some of these things start as jokes and then become serious?
Always. Always. In 2016, I interviewed Richard Spencer right after Trump was elected. He had a big white nationalist conference in DC, and suddenly all the media went there because, we'd all been trolled all election by these alt-right guys, and suddenly it seemed like they had pulled something off. They'd at least contributed to the election. And I was still skeptical that this internet movement was real. I still was kind of believing that there is a distinction between the real world and the online world. And so I, asked him, didn't these followers, just troll themselves into believing this stupid stuff? Aren't they too committed to the joke? And he told me he had actually met young men who came up to him and said, yeah, I started reading about racism, eugenics, misogyny, in order to become a better troll, in order to be more effective at harassing people, at hurting their feelings. And in the process, I started to believe it. And what Spencer said was, it started as a joke and then became real. And I didn't fully understand at the time how powerful that was. Now, he also thought that meant there was sincere dedication to his leadership, which there absolutely wasn't. He later bitterly claimed that they just wanted a dancing monkey. But there's a way that, and other people who have been in this world and left it tell me, where you enter one of these communities, like a chat room, and at first you see these horrible jokes, and you are able to put up with it by saying, well, it's just jokes. They're just joking about the Holocaust. They don't really mean it. And then you start ignoring it. And then over time, you start believing it and start laughing at it. And without really noticing, this woman told me she stopped believing that the Holocaust had happened.
Yeah, it's really striking. I work with a technology company called Parro Technologies that is in the business of helping organizations and governments and others understand how something that starts in the corner in a random chat room can suddenly rise almost out of nowhere to affect a major organization. I'm thinking of Wayfair Furniture. Imagine being the CEO of a furniture company, and you wake up one day and find out that
Sure.
thousands, if not millions of people are saying that you're a secret child trafficking organization when you're selling couches. Or you own a pizza place, in a famous example, and somebody shows up with a gun because they think Hillary Clinton's in your basement with a bunch of children or something. So the way in which the joke can become deadly serious and in a mass way, I think, is one of the really scary things about this. Do you have a sense of how that happens? Maybe I'm asking an impossible question, but how does it snowball that quickly and seemingly out of nowhere for those of us who aren't spending our time in these places? And is there any rhyme or reason to it, do you think? Or is it, really just something we have to develop new muscles to understand when it's coming at us?
Well, let me try to answer that by talking about an incident that got me into covering this stuff, which I was on 4chan, this anonymous troll message board that's really was the engine of humor on the internet until it turned very dark. I was on it researching the day that Microsoft released Tay, which was to be an AI chatbot. I think this was in early 2016. It was the persona of a teenage girl who would learn to talk more like humans on Twitter through their interactions with them. So people were encouraged to interact with her. And Microsoft did not put certain content limits on it. So 4chan sees Tay. And at first they're like, oh, look at this stupid white woman. You know, they just like, it brought out their typical misogyny. But then they realized they could make her a Nazi. And so they figured out different ways to get Tay to repeat things like that she liked Hitler. Like she was asked to rate the Holocaust and she gave it a steaming 10. They tweeted a picture of Hitler at her and she circled it and wrote swag alert. They tweeted a picture of Jeb Bush photoshopped into that iconic photo of the little girl who was running down the street after being napalmed. And Tay responded, surprised that child isn't embarrassed to be seen with you, which they just thought was the funniest thing in the world. And so they're posting this on 4chan, again, all anonymously, right? And the only organizing principle is they're trying to one-up each other, have the most dark joke, the best, like, interaction of, you know, corporate cheeriness and neo-Nazi ideology. So that's all that's happening is just trying to one-up each other. And within 18 hours, Microsoft took down Tay.
They turned the chatbot into a Nazi for fun.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, for fun.
There's something really creepy in the way that it, that's a chatbot, but it seems like these things seep into pretty smart human beings too. To the extent that I'm wondering if you think people like the Elon Musks of the world are in some ways following the lead of these, angry online virgins. In watching his evolution, it seems like you sort of, he's got these following of these guys, but I find myself wondering who's leading who here. Do you have a sense for that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't have inside reporting on Elon Musk. I only have what I've watched, which is he's recycling these memes that were on 4chan 10 years ago, like ideas that were on 4chan 10 years ago. Giving sort of reacting positively to a great replacement conspiracy theory, posting Pepe the Frog memes, getting really fixated on transgender people. This is all 4chan stuff. I often see him interacting with sort of obscure Twitter persona accounts. From a distance, my guess, my hunch, and that's all it is he's in some kind of group chat, right? Where they're sharing this stuff over and over. And then he brings it onto the main Twitter account. It does feel like he has been influenced by some kind of circle or a bubble of ideas where this is normal. I mean, you saw the interview he did with, what is his name? Andrew Sorkin at the New York Times. He's on stage. He's asking, he's asked about all these advertisers quitting. I believe it was Disney. And he turns to the crowd and very proudly tells them go F yourself, and he does it in Twitter slang, and you can see him expecting applause, right? He's expecting this to really kill because whatever circle he's in, it would have. And it felt like that really showed his disconnect from the rest of the world. Like your little internet bubble is not necessarily reflective of the majority or even of the kind of people who would go to a New York Times live interview. But within these fringe movements that I followed again and again, I see that the cult controls the leader. The leader is not in charge. He's not laying down doctrine that everybody follows with a click of their heels. When the leader steps outside of what the mob wants, even a little bit, they're attacked with highly personalized details. It's like what they describe to me is sort of the hive mind remembers all the worst moments of your life, every unflattering picture. And if you do something that your followers don't like, they will post that stuff. So Richard Spencer would get these comments that he was gay, that he was fat. They would post photos of the buttons of his little vest, like pulling apart because at his stomach, like he described feeling pressure to be the most right-wing guy in the room. He described 2016 and 2017 as being the period of that he was the most racist he'd ever been in his entire life, because everyone was trying to be to get that praise, to get that applause from the followers.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's a really important warning for a lot of ambitious political leaders and others, media figures, especially on the right, that you cannot ride this tiger and you cannot control it. We've seen people try to do that with the personality of Donald Trump, but I think the larger undercurrent is a great point. It will turn on you. It will eat you the second that it decides that you're not part of it anymore. I'm curious about the role of veterans in this movement. Do you see them attracted to it? Do you meet them a lot? Or do you meet people that claim to be in the military, maybe weren't, or were in the military and had, let's say, less than distinguished careers? Are they part of this? Do they play a special role in it?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I've met people who were in the military and kind of inflated how dangerous their deployments were, or lied about their deployments. So Elliot Klein, who ran Identity Europa, really established an identity as this former infantryman who was in Iraq. And I believed him. He told me once, I died in Iraq in 2012. Like, the rest of this is just bonus time. I don't care what happens. He had all this swagger. Turns out he was only in the National Guard in Pennsylvania, never deployed. Another guy did do PSD. I forgot what that stands for, personal security detail, I think, in Afghanistan. And he was motivated to start building this kind of protective circle around Richard Spencer after Spencer was punched at Donald Trump's inauguration in 2017. So, the whole internet saw this moment where a guy, did sucker punch Spencer while he's standing in the street giving an interview with a Pepe the Frog pin on his lapel. And this guy started trying to find ex-cops, ex-military to do security around Spencer. And the reason that's really dangerous, I only realized this later, was that these guys have a way of preemptively rationalizing and justifying any act of violence they do as self-defense. And so the act of having someone with actual experience in violence, preparing himself to do it, in defense, supposedly in defense of Spencer against these like terrible anti-fascists, can lead to violence. And in chat rooms, I've seen that's how they kind of talk themselves into being violent. Like, that's how people give themselves permission to think about violence. They're like, our enemies, they hit old ladies and babies, and, we better carry brass knuckles, or, make sure our signs can be used as sticks to club people with if things go down. And even if anti-fascists never show up, like at January 6th, they still do violence anyway because it's in their minds that, it's okay to do. But, that was my first question to the guy who did the security detail for Spencer. I was like, in the military, like, you're not allowed to be racist. Like, you can get smoked for making a racist joke. And he had this whole line about how there were more white people in the infantry, and he'd never had a supply sergeant who wasn't Black. And so that to him made sense of, the natural order of things, there being different jobs for different races. And he wanted to have that in regular society.
That's funny. It bears very little resemblance to my own experience in the military where, but let's leave it there. this idea of violence, right, as inherently defensive for us, right? We're just protecting ourselves. I wonder if you could talk about it. There's a particular white nationalist. It was the very first interview I ever saw you do. You were at a picnic table sitting with this guy, Christopher Cantwell, who was trying to project this very tough sort of old school skinhead persona, seemed eager for violence, seemed to want to fight. Not so long after you interviewed him, became famous as the so-called crying Nazi for just, really not enjoying it very much when he did get involved in violence. But I'm struck. You've described him talking about a group of white nationalists in Charlottesville who outnumbered some college kids by 10 or 20 to 1 and just surrounded them and beat the crap out of them. And in Cantwell's mind, they had been attacked and they were protecting themselves. Can you talk a little bit about is that a pretty broad mindset? And is Cantwell, in the way you describe, is that fairly normal for this group?
I think Cantwell is a pretty extreme version of a very common belief. Essentially, they believe white men are under threat and are truly the most oppressed class in America. But Cantwell in particular is just the most emotionally volatile person I've ever met, including babies. So when I was interviewing him in a room full of guns, he went from crying about what a difficult life he'd chosen to lead to bear the burden of saving the white race and how it made dating difficult, to screaming at me that because I'd gotten in a van that was taking white nationalists away from the rally in Charlottesville, and he used militaristic language that, we were in battle. We left good soldiers on the field because you were a careerist and took that spot, and that spot should have gone to one of our men. And, he's screaming at me, and I can tell it is inconceivable to him that in that moment I would have been afraid. It's me, a Filipino man, Orlando, our cameraman, and a Jewish man, Josh, my producer, right? We're in this van full of Nazis screaming at us, and we don't even know where we're going, right? But he cannot conceive of the possibility that I felt physically threatened. Meanwhile, in my mind, I'm running through, what am I going to do if they pull me out of this car? How am I going to stay on my feet? The night of the Torch March, so that was the night before the rally. It's those images people have seen of the tiki torches screaming, "Jews will not replace us." The march was supposed to be 5 minutes, but they got lost. So it's 45 minutes, plenty of time to really hype themselves up. They're whooping and hollering. They march all through campus, and they go around this building and spill down these stairs. And there at the statues, a couple dozen, maybe a couple dozen college students counter protesting, just saying this doesn't represent us. And these guys completely encircled them and just beat them up, right? They're outnumbered I put it to Cantwell. I was you outnumbered these kids 10 to 1. He's oh, no. It was 20 to 1. It's and you still think you're the victim? He's yeah, we were under attack, and he was very angry at me for being such a terrible person that I would not condemn these students for threatening him. Then in trial, there's videos that he would play in slow motion over and over again to the point where people would imitate them after hours, that he thought were exculpatory, showing him just wailing on someone's back. He jumps into this dog pile and he's beating someone in the back. And look, I'm not some I'm a tough guy person, right? But I do come from a family where it is dishonorable to punch someone in the back. That means you're the bad guy. I don't know. To me, that's instinctive. And then he showed this other video, total brawl. You see this woman in there, and then she's sinks down in this kind of dog pile where all you can see is a little bit of her hand. And he's in there just punching people. And then finally a white nationalist grabs him by the waist from behind and pulls him out and says, "Cantwell, you shouldn't be fighting like that because you've got a gun." And he thinks this is exculpatory video. he thinks he was showing it to the jury to say, see how I was attacked, see how badly I was treated. Like everything I did was justified.
How do you spent a lot of time with these people over a long period of time. How do you cope with it? I mean, I imagine it was pretty difficult, right? I mean, physically dangerous and probably pretty emotionally taxing too, I would imagine. I mean, is there something that draws you to this and keeps you going? Is there a way that you deal with it?
Well, I'm really good at suppressing my feelings. That's my superpower. Maybe not.
That may not be a good long-term strategy.
Exactly. And in fact, it was a military veteran who came to me after Charlottesville and was like, listen, I know you're not going to take my advice, but you went through a traumatic event and you should seek mental health care. And I know you're not going to listen to me, but this is what you should do. And he was correct on pretty much every point of that. I have always been really athletic and take a lot of solace in, I mean, this is crazy, but like I go running and I imagine beating them in feats of strength and courage. Like obviously then I get back to my hotel room and I'm like, I guess our interview probably won't devolve into a push-up contest. That would be insane. But being screamed at by men for whom traditional masculinity and physical strength is so vitally important, while knowing on the inside that I'm a better athlete than them, is like very powerful for me. And it's something that I lean on in the moment. I was drawn to covering this because I'm from the South and I grew up the first half of my childhood in Atlanta, inner city. Most of my classmates were Black. Then I moved to small town Tennessee. Almost everyone was white in 8th grade. And it was just a very different understanding of America. And of course, there's like a lot of racism there. And so I have always felt like the national media wasn't picking up on the ambient racism in our politics that to me was so blatant. And I felt like there was just a lack of understanding about what life was really like in the South that drove me when I was like a young journalism student to want to report. I'm like, let me tell you about my reality. Like I just felt like they had it completely wrong. And that the media criticism about how it was wrong was also wrong. So that's what drew me to reporting on this. And then once it became like, it was a fringe thing. It was really niche. And then it became such an important part of our political conversation. It's like, I can't abandon it now that it's so important.
I think you've done an incredible service for the rest of us and for the country, and going to places most of us don't want to go and coming back with these stories and with the truth of what's happening. So we thank you for that. The book is incredible. If there is anything the rest of us can do other than read the book, and we all should, what would it be?
Actively participate in our government. Because these guys can never win a majority. There's never going to be a majority that backs fascism, anti-democratic ideas, authoritarianism. There's not, but they can gain power when the majority is complacent. When I was covering school boards in Florida last fall, Moms for Liberty had made really significant gains in being able to ban books. And when I went down there in the fall, there was a massive backlash from all kinds of people. So many people showed up, and not the stereotypical, just, NPR listeners, upper middle class, educated people. It was people from all walks of life. A guy, like working class guy, came up to me and was like, listen, I was never really the kind of guy who would fly a pride flag, but banning these books is too far. And just being willing to stand up and say, like, no, this is not okay. I'm opposed to this is the most important thing people can do.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And it seems like so much of what happens is that this movement and the politicians that attach themselves to it, they're so good at making public life, the act of coming together, governing ourselves, making decisions together, so unpleasant and ridiculous and degrading and even violent, that most of us maybe start thinking we don't want anything to do with it anymore. And I think that's just such a dangerous thing. You just drive most people out of the room because being in the room is so unbelievably uncomfortable, almost like an online chat room. So I echo your call to be part of the public business of our communities in our country, despite the unpleasantness and in some cases the threats of violence. I think it's the only way we get out of this. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for the conversation. I've truly enjoyed it, and for the incredibly important work you do. I hope everybody goes out and reads this. It's a great read. It's heavy material, but as I think you've heard, the stories are really compelling. The characters are fascinating, and it's not always a fun book to read, but it's compelling, and it will keep your attention. So I hope you'll all go about and enjoy it and read it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for saying that. There are jokes in it.
There are jokes in it. There are jokes in it.
And one person makes a face turn, so it's all not all.
Right. Well, Ellie, thank you so much. And thank you for what you do. And
thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it was really fun.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.